Hello, and welcome to the Knife and Fork Show. I'm Jason Huffman, the Editor-in-Chief of Food Chemical News. Quick, what sound does it make when you drop an Alka-Seltzer pill in its glass of water? It goes fizz. Well, though it might ultimately prove to be a good thing for consumers and protecting the safety of our food supply, FSMA, an acronym that stands for the FDA Food Safety Modernization Act, is something that is having the exact opposite effect of an Alka-Seltzer tablet on the food industry. And here to talk about it with us today is another talented member of my staff. In fact, we are told that she is today the single most experienced reporter covering the food beat at FDA. I'm talking, of course, about Joan Murphy. Thanks for joining us, Joan. All right, so what is FSMA and what's it going to do?
FSMA is like you said, the Food Safety Modernization Act. It was drafted because there was a lot of high-profile outbreaks going on. First, the 2006 spinach outbreak with E. coli, and then there was melamine in pet food, and then there was, there was salmonella in peanut products, and all those really high-profile outbreaks made Congress just drag the food industry in, consumer groups in, to oversight hearings to say what is happening here, what can we do? So they drafted the Food Safety Modernization Act, and it passed. And now the food industry is really grappling with what it means.
So it was signed by Obama in 2010.
Right, in January.
And I remember all through the years leading up to that, there were a lot of debates about different types of legislation to help improve food safety. And it couldn't seem to get past square one.
Yes.
It would get hung up in these committees. And ultimately something pushed it through. It was that peanut outbreak,
the peanut
wasn't it?
outbreak. I think that what happened was one peanut supplier, and it was a small company, but it supplied to so many companies that process peanuts. And there was a possibility that was contaminated, and so there was a major recall. And I think it was a wake-up call to the industry that a small supplier could actually have this effect on all the way through the supply chain. And I think that got the attention of the food industry to say, wait a minute, we need everyone on a level playing field. We need everyone to follow new food standards.
One of the things I remember about that outbreak was there were a sizable number of people who got sick, but even bigger were the number of products that were affected because peanuts are in everything.
Yes, it was like hundreds, I think almost 1,000. I mean, it was a huge number. And for the first time, I think consumer groups were always trying to get this law, but for the first time, I think the food industry started saying, okay, now it's time for something that we know that we get food from our supplier, that they are following like federal minimum standards. Right. And the same thing happened with the produce industry, because when that E. coli spinach outbreak happened, then the produce industry started saying, you know what, maybe we do need a federal standard. Okay. So that's why it was drafted.
But can you give me kind of just a quick sort of a recap of a couple of the bigger things that are in the law?
Sure. I think the three major provisions in the law are the produce safety standards, that for the first time will set federal standards for growers and packers. So they'll meet like standards on water quality that they use on their produce, and soil amendments. I mean, these are things that have never been federal standards. It's only been guidelines. So that'll be the first thing that I think is going to be really major, and that'll have impact in importers. Importers will have to meet these standards. So the second thing I think is something called preventive controls. Right. And that regulation, which has been split in two by FDA for human food and feed, tells companies really what companies like Kraft and other large companies are already doing. They have to go through their process of their facility. They have to see where there's hazards. They have to control for those hazards. They have to write a food safety plan, and that food safety plan for the first time will be open for inspection when food safety inspectors come to the plant. So they'll have more access to records under FSMA, and so they'll be able to know really what food companies are doing every day instead of these, quick inspections they've done once every 4 or 5 years to look at a plant. So now they'll be able to see how they're actually controlling for hazards. So that's the second thing. And the third thing, I think, is the Foreign Supplier Verification Program.
Yeah, I was wondering if you were going to mention that on the top
that's
of
the top three, because that one really tells importers, hey, your suppliers have to have a verification program in place that that makes sure food coming into this country is not misbranded or adulterated. And those are the two things that they have to make sure. So they have to meet our standards for the first time. And I mean, it's always been thought of that food companies were But this puts it, it enshrines it into law, and it also pushes the responsibility back on the importer to say, you know, you have to make sure that they have a plan. And if they're not, if that they're meeting these standards, if they're not, they can't come into this country. They have to have a foreign supplier verification program in place to bring food into this country.
There's some issue over who's going to verify that these companies are in compliance or meet the standards that the FDA wants them to meet.
Yeah.
And it may end up being the governments of the foreign countries at this point, right? Isn't that part of the law?
That's true. I mean, the governments can actually become third-party auditors to make sure that the food coming in is meeting certain standards. So that's a first time that FDA has ever done that, because FDA has always been checking, you know, a small, you know, 1% of all the food coming into the border at the border, at ports. So this is the first time that they're saying, okay, maybe other people, other like third-party auditors, other companies, you know, could check for us to make sure they're actually complying before it comes to the port. So this is really pushing back the responsibility of prevention and food safety into the countries where they're coming from. So it's really revolutionary for food safety. Yeah. I mean, it sounds very common sense, but it's something that this country has never had.
My recollection of when this story kind of started to kind of leak out when the legislation was passed was that a lot of the foreign countries were unaware of what was happening.
I think they still are. Here's the problem. The regulations aren't out yet.
Right.
And I think that FDA is ready to move with this incredible outreach, rolling out public meetings, you know, everything when the regulations go into place.
That's the other question I wanted to ask you, because FDA put a lot of these regulations, gave a lot of them to the White House, the Office of Management and Budget, months ago.
Right,
and
in
they're
November.
Still sitting there, right?
Yes.
What is going on? Why are these regulations not coming out? What's the hang up?
Yeah, this is a very interesting situation, because you have the groups like the Grocery Manufacturers of America, you know, Center for Science and the Public Interest. You have all these different groups pushing the OMB, this Office of Management Budget, to kick out these regulations. They want them out, and they were due, like the produce one was due in January, but the other regulations really are due finalized in July of this year. Right. So really
January
they've been pushing.
And July were the two major deadlines for a lot of these regulations, and we don't have. I mean, they've released a few things.
They've released a few things with FSMA. Yeah, they have. They have a plan for smuggled food, prior notice. They've changed the things. Changed some provisions in prior notice to make sure if you have a refused product in another country, it has to be, you have to tell this country. So there's certain things that have actually happened, but the problem with these regulations is there's a presidential election in November.
They're kind of in a pickle.
They're in a pickle because the produce standards are going to slam rural America. I mean, that is where our produce is grown in this country. So it is an issue that it's also going to cost a lot. So the economic analysis, I think, is what's holding up these regulations. It's going to cost to get a brand new food safety program. And FDA, on the enforcement side, they're trying to get money out of Congress. And they're not even getting enough money out of Congress to really write the regulations and to enforce. And then you look at the food industry that's going to have to comply with a brand new program that's going to be costly. I mean, it's just going to cost a lot all the way around.
Uh-oh, bad news. We're out of time again. Thanks to Joe Murphy for joining us today. We'll be back soon and put another food regulation personality in the spotlight. If you have trouble finding us, just go to www.foodchemicalnews.com.